All right, how's everyone doing? Good? All right, so as I've already said, I used to be a school teacher, and there's gonna be some interactivity in this, and the tricky thing about me is I'm gonna ask you to participate, and if you don't, I'm just gonna like awkwardly stand here till you do. So like, let's all save ourselves the trouble and like get really into it. This talk is obviously very, very serious, and my title here is Why the hashtag Wasm Summit website isn't written in Wasm and what that means for the future of Wasm. Very specifically, according to me, AG Dubs, a hashtag organizer of the hashtag Wasm Summit. Now, I know it's a little weird to be an organizer and to give a talk, but I would encourage you to talk with both Aaron and Surma. I kind of submitted this proposal as a joke and then desperately argued against it being accepted and I failed. Like many things I try and do, I failed at that. So we are going to sit through this. So this title is really, really long, and so just to kick it off, I did compile it to WebAssembly, which I'm presenting here, not a monospace typeface, so it's very beautiful. This is definitely a better way to do it. But to translate it a little bit more into English, this talk is about WebAssembly and JavaScript, and in particular, the fact that I do not believe that WebAssembly is here to kill JavaScript. So just to get a show of hands, and please do be proud of this opinion, do you think that WebAssembly should kill JavaScript? I knew there would be some of you here. All right, so you're gonna have to handle this talk, but this talk is actually very specific for you because, I don't think that WebAssembly is here to kill JavaScript, but if it is, we're doing it wrong. Which is to say that if you really would like WebAssembly to kill JavaScript, I think that we need to change some tactics and change some strategies in order to see the adoption and success that we currently have with JavaScript today. So if you think I'm up here and I'm against your opinion, perhaps I can bait you with the fact that by the end of this talk, I will hopefully have described a future where if you want WebAssembly to kill JavaScript, these are the things that we should do to get there. All right, so my name is Ashley Williams, but I go by AG Dubs on the internet. If you follow me on Twitter, I'm sorry. This is me dressed as a crab because I am on the core team of the Rust programming language, and our unofficial mascot is Ferris, who is a crustacean, and that's because Rust people are called rustaceans. There won't be many more good puns in this talk, but hopefully you enjoyed those. I'm obviously very famous. Please visit my SoundCloud. Just kidding. I work at a different orange cloud company called Cloudflare. No, I don't have a SoundCloud, but maybe I should have one. And what I do at Cloudflare is I work on a service called Workers, which is a way to run your software, not on the client, not on the server, but what is called the infrastructure edge. And it's all very edgy, and I decided that a way to make it edgier would be to take Rust-generated WebAssembly and put it on that. So really, really trying to be on the bleeding edge of all these types of things. And the edge puns, again, I'm so sorry. But as I said, I am on the Rust core team, and I also work on the Rust Wasm working group. This is a picture of some folks here. Many of them are in the audience, which is super exciting. And I work on this tool called Wasm Pack, which Alon brought up in his talk, which is super awesome. I actually, when I saw him talking about WasmOpt, I was like, oh shoot, I gotta tell him about the new release that automatically runs WasmOpt. So he mentioned that. He mentioned that if you wanna write some Rust, you wanna do it in a way that feels very ergonomic, make some small binaries, you can check out this tool. I'm super excited about it. I also have stickers if you'd like some. All right, so finally, and this is only because it's really relevant to this talk, before I started working on Rust and working on WebAssembly, I worked for a company called NPM, and I was also on the board of directors of Node, which is to say, I'm biased. I do kind of love JavaScript. Now, depending on how closely you follow internet rage, you may notice that I also kind of rage quit Node, and that's like a whole nother thing. But I think that JavaScript has a soft spot in my heart, and I'm really, really excited about JavaScript in very similar ways that I am to WebAssembly. So we have a lot of amazing talks at this conference, and a lot of them are going to focus on a lot of use cases of WebAssembly. They're going to be very technical. This talk is not that. So that slide where I wrote WebAssembly to compile my talk title is probably the only code you're going to see. This talk is a talk about values. And I think that talks about values are very important, particularly as Lynn said in her talk. I think we're at a very, very interesting and exciting time in WebAssembly's life. And I really want us to think deeply about where we're going in the future. So I have a couple of values. One of my values is that I really, really like thinking about thinking. There are a lot of compiler-like people in this room, very computer science-focused people. I have a degree in philosophy and neuroscience, and I was a middle school science teacher. So I'm slightly out of my depth in lots of these things, but I do really like thinking about the type of thinking that happens when people write code. And this desire has really brought me to really being motivated by building tools that people use. Fundamentally, if anybody asks, like, what is your career goal, Ashley, is that I want to build something that people use. And when I think about WebAssembly, that is my major goal. And then finally, I really like to work on technologies that I think are empowering. And I'll dive a little bit more into this, but I want the theme of empowerment to kind of fill throughout this talk. Because I do think that WebAssembly could be the next big tool that empowers lots and lots of people to build really, really amazing things, both for the web and beyond. So that's a lot about values, but fundamentally, this is a talk about a website, right? A website that I assume almost everybody in this conference room has been to. So when I met Surma at Chrome Dev Summit, and he was like, I think we're going to do like a WebAssembly conference. And I was like, cool, like when? And he was like, February. And I was like, oh. And then I cursed because it was not very long. And so we quickly had to stand up a website and get registrations. And I'm so glad that everybody came because you did not have a very long time to figure all of that out. And one of the things that we had to do was build a website. And luckily we had a team of folks who was working on that, and it was cool. But when we finished that website and I wanted to announce it, I wanted to be cheeky about it. And so again, I spelled the word hashtag out. But then I said, hey, we have a website, but it's not in Wasm. Here's a cool talk idea why the Wasm Summit website should be in Wasm. And so immediately upon tweeting this, I end up in Surma's DMs and I go, I actually think a better talk would be why it's not in Wasm. And he was like, you got to submit it. And so here we are. So what is the WebAssembly Summit website made in? It is made primarily in TypeScript. And it is also some JavaScript, and that's cool. Now, I could give a whole talk diving in to all of the technologies currently being used in the website, but I don't actually think that that is super interesting. The Wasm Summit website is not in Wasm. It's in JavaScript. And what I think the really interesting question is should it be in Wasm? And is WebAssembly the type of technology where a website like this should be written in it? And with that, as I said, I'm a philosopher by heart. I came to this question. What does WebAssembly want? Right? That's kind of a weird question, right? But hopefully, by the end of this talk, we'll figure that out. So the first thing I did in my endeavor to try and figure out what WebAssembly as a technology would want is I went to the website. And so this is the lovely webassembly.org website. And here, just at the front, what we can see is it says, WebAssembly is a binary instruction format for a stack-based virtual machine. Wasm is designed as a portable target for compilation of high-level languages like C, C++, and Rust. Okay. Enabling deployment on the web for client and server applications. Now, when I first saw this, I remember seeing that as like high-level languages like Rust. Okay. All right, this is very interesting. And so again, WebAssembly goes on throughout its website to explain a whole bunch of different things. Now, when I saw this website, I couldn't help but be reminded of this website. Has anybody seen this website? This is the old Rust website, which many, many people love and we don't use anymore. And part of the reason we don't is the way we describe Rust. Here it says Rust is a systems programming language that runs blazingly fast, prevents segfaults, and guarantees thread safety. Featuring zero-cost abstractions, move semantics, trait-based generics. All right. this was a big problem, and we don't have this website anymore because fundamentally, this website didn't speak to the people who we wanted to hear it. They looked like this. It was ridiculous. And so I was like, all right, maybe it's not super fair. I'm going to check out the original white paper. Maybe this can be, maybe slightly more accessible. And admittedly, I think a lot of the white papers in the WebAssembly world are really fantastically written, except I kind of get in trouble when I hit this. This is a lot. Now I'm like, oh, cool, I know one of these, unreachable. I've had that before. But yeah, this can be really, really, really intimidating. And so I remember one of the first times I was reading the spec, I was like, what the heck is going on with this? But I was on an airplane to a job interview, and I was like so sure that I had to read the whole WebAssembly spec and know it really hard to pass the interview. Did not need that in any way, but I was very sure. And so I was sitting on this airplane, and I guess it was having an air conditioning problem or something, but it was really, really hot. I'm reading the spec, and I'm also listening to the airplane radio, and Despacito is playing. And I'm just looking at this, right, while listening to Despacito, and I'm like, I feel like maybe I'm the only person who's ever done this, because this felt so intimidating while also listening to such an accessible song. I was just like, I don't know, I feel very out of my element. Perhaps I'm the only person on the planet who has had this experience. And a lot of people agreed, and I was actually very glad to hear that WebAssembly, you can do it to the Despacito theme. And that made me feel a lot better about it. But I was fundamentally pretty disappointed because it was incredibly hard for me to read. There was no way I was going to understand that text. So when I saw that, it reminded me again of the marketing we had had for Rust, and it kind of had this attitude of we're close to the metal, sorry, not sorry. And that was tough, because at the end of the day, I knew that what Rust wanted to do was to be an empowering language, and I feel the same way about WebAssembly. So what we realized was no one understands what this means, especially the people that we want to reach. And I think that really matters. And so if you're slowly beginning to think that this might actually be a talk on marketing, and you're getting really nervous and you want to go hide in the bathroom, that's fine. But marketing actually is really, really, really important. So part of the reason I knew that the Rust website didn't reach the people that we wanted to reach was because for a very long time, I was the primary instructor of a program called RustBridge. And every time I held one of these classes, I would stand in front of that group, and I would pull up the website, and then I'd have to read that tagline. And it was brutal. And I could basically teach the entire class picking out pieces of that tagline to be all right, we should do this. And we still haven't gotten to almost any of the syntax. And so that was really motivating for me to be we really need to change this. And so Rust changed its website, but WebAssembly still has its. And we still have the question, what does WebAssembly want? So lastly, I will mention, I'm not alone in this. You don't have to be a complete beginner to find some of these things deeply unapproachable. And so this was an issue that came up. And I do understand why a lot of this syntax happens to still be in the paper. The question of who the audience for WebAssembly is, I think, is really interesting. Because for many people, this type of syntax would actually be completely applicable, particularly implementers. But for folks who are just interested, hey, I want to try out this new WebAssembly thing, it can be deeply, deeply intimidating. So right before we did the web design, the redesign of the Rust website, I gave a keynote at RustConf, and I used this slide, and I thought it was very interesting. So for folks in here who might not know, this is a Captain Planet. And we talk about it when our powers combine. And so when we think about who are the people who are coming to WebAssembly, who are the audiences we have? All right, so we have all of the different ones. They stick their rings together and they become superheroes that fight climate change. Really, precocious. Anyway, so, people who are interested in Rust, people who are interested in C++, JavaScript developers, folks from academia, and at the end of the day, new developers. I have taught brand new developers Rust as their first language, and I think we should all agree that if WebAssembly is to be successful, people compiling something to WebAssembly and having that be their very first program is not only likely, but should be a future that we're looking towards. And it was interesting looking at this because this is exactly the same slide that I used in the RustConf slide, and these feel like the audiences that we're also addressing with WebAssembly. There's in fact even more. And this plurality is both very, very exciting, and I think very, very nerve-wracking, because it is very, very difficult to please this many audiences with this many different desires and needs. All right. So I still don't entirely know what WebAssembly wants, but I think one of the things we can do is ask these people what they want from WebAssembly. So I did something very scientific. I think many of you participated, if you happen to be extremely online, but I did a series of Twitter polls that I think had some very interesting thoughts. So we saw that WebAssembly and its spec and its website was talking about being fast, being portable, but one of the things it didn't entirely talk about was this idea of being multi-language. Again, it is certainly in there, but it doesn't seem super highlighted. But so I asked, if you could answer the question, why WebAssembly, and you could only pick one reason, what reason would you pick? So I listed a couple of things here. I will say that the most predominant one in other was that people liked it as being kind of like a universal target. You get limited amount of space and options in this, so it's clearly not a science. But kind of unsurprising to me, a lot of people chose the fact that you can use multiple languages to target WebAssembly as being their primary reason that they were excited about it. And so I actually kind of guessed that this was going to be it, and I posted a second question, which was, hey, let's assume, again, extremely hypothetically, that multi-language is kind of your favorite, what you think is the best reason for WebAssembly. Why? And so there were a bunch of things here, and I think that this was quite interesting. I think the most confusing option that I listed here was pre-existing app distro, which again, they only let you put so many characters in, but that was trying to be a reference to one of the very first demos of WebAssembly, which was when they compiled AutoCAD and put it in the browser. I think it's actually a very compelling use case for WebAssembly, and we've seen it demonstrated a couple of times now. However, I don't think it's the one that people seem to care about the most. And so here we can see, again, not really a science, but library reuse, and then JS doesn't meet my needs. And I saw that coming. It doesn't take long to post something about WebAssembly on some sort of social media where someone comes in and is like, I want JavaScript to die. And you're like, okay, let's talk about it though first before we do some murders. But yeah, so again, I kind of expected the JavaScript doesn't meet my needs was going to come up. And so I said, again, all right, extremely hypothetically, JavaScript doesn't meet my needs is why you're excited about a target that supports multiple languages. Why? And so I listed a couple. Ecosystem doesn't meet need. You can see I left a space out because of the character count. It's really, really cool. But again, perf is bad and consistent. And what I thought was actually quite interesting is don't understand / like it. I was going to write just don't like it, and then I was like, people will pick that too much. So I was like, people don't like saying they don't understand something, so I'll mix the understanding with the like to dissuade people from it. Yet many people were very, very happy to pick that choice, and I think it's very interesting that it's a second to this perf is bad and inconsistent. So I'm not going to talk too much about perf. I just do want to give a shout out to FitchGen. Whenever I talk about WebAssembly, I freaking love this graph. It's from a blog post he wrote on oxidizing source maps in Firefox using Rust-generated WebAssembly. But again, if you're worried about consistency and performance, I love this chart. Anyways, last but not least, to round out the poll, I wanted to know who I was talking to. And I said, all right, tell me a little bit about yourself. And what I thought was very, very interesting, given how many people were so dissatisfied with JavaScript, was that the vast majority of people in this wrote JavaScript, but hadn't written any WebAssembly. They just had written JavaScript. And in general, what you can see from this is most people wrote JavaScript, and very, very few people only wrote WebAssembly or wrote WebAssembly at all. I do think it's interesting that 18% of the group had not written WebAssembly or JavaScript, but this is what happens when you try and do science on Twitter. So I guess the error rate is 18%, which makes all of these numbers kind of garbage. That being said, we need a premise for a talk, and so let's use some of this data as that premise. So what do these things mean? So one of the things that I noticed was, I think we can all agree that to a certain extent, especially in the browser environment, JavaScript has an unwilling monopoly, which is to say they have a monopoly and nobody really has a choice about it. Everybody is forced into it. And I think that that's really interesting. When I worked at NPM for a very long time, the package manager, we also found ourselves in a fascinating position of being a kind of unwilling monopoly, where people felt like they had to use it and that they didn't have a choice. So JavaScript is very interesting, and I'll get into that in a second, but we have 2 more points. The second one being that performance is not as large of a concern as you would expect. I remember when WebAssembly first came out, it was all like, yeah, we're going to go fast now. And there are even people who are like, well, JavaScript can go fast too. And you're like, OK. But I do believe the idea of opening the web up to more source languages than simply JavaScript does seem to at least be the most emotional reason that a lot of people have behind WebAssembly. And I think that that is very, very interesting. And then finally, and I'll spend some more time on this too, I was just struck by how many people haven't tried Wasm yet. Now, as somebody who writes one of the tool chains that helps try to get people into Wasm, I am relatively keenly aware of how few people use it compared to, say, a tool like something like NPM or other JavaScript tools. But I think it's also a very interesting data point as we think about now being a moment where we determine the future of WebAssembly. So we're going to dive into these 3 points now. All right, so the first one is JavaScript has an unwilling monopoly, and that's fair. So this is one of my favorite lines from the ECMAScript spec. How many people here have read the ECMAScript spec? I really like it. I think it's really fun. Anyways, so this line says, ECMAScript syntax is relaxed to enable it to serve as an easy-to-use scripting language. I love the idea of a language being relaxed. Like, what's an uptight language look like? I think that's delightful. But I do think it does kind of describe a fair number of things about JavaScript. And so JavaScript, the language we know and love, it is by far the most wanted language and is the most commonly used language in a professional development. So one of the things I do think was very interesting, this is the Stack Overflow quiz or survey from the last year. And you can see here JavaScript is one of the top most wanted. WebAssembly is already there? That's exciting, right? I was like, oh, that's super cool. But JavaScript is the language that many, many, many people are doing development in. If you are a developer, you are almost certainly writing some JavaScript today. So I bring that up only to say, if you could imagine a technology killing the absolute most popular language, JavaScript at the moment, it's very interesting. And again, if you do want to kill it, it's kind of like a, if you take a shot at the king, you best not miss. Sorry, this is getting dark all of a sudden. I didn't know there'd be so much murder. Anyways. So yeah, one of the things, we see that JavaScript today is just so very popular, and I care a lot about philosophy. And so there's a philosopher named Thomas Kuhn who wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. If you are trying to make technology or really anything new happen, I strongly recommend reading this book. It's absolutely fantastic. But he kind of kicks off the book with this premise that scientists work from models. And they work from them often without knowing or needing to know the characteristics that gave those models the status of community paradigms. Which is to say, we have these things that are community paradigms, and we often operate within them without questioning them. It's kind of the idea of you're a fish, and someone goes you're in water, and you're like, wait, what? I didn't notice. And I think that we often do that in technology today. So to do that, to look at what the water is that made JavaScript so popular and how we found ourselves in this position today, I'm going to give you a very brief and absolutely incomplete history of programming language development. I'm going to show you this graph. Someone's going to tell me RISC-V isn't on here, and I'm just telling you, don't tweet it. I know, OK? I'm trying to make a point, and if you want to find patterns, you got to shape your data a little. Anyway, so you can see here on the y-axis, this is metalness, which is very scientific. And then here on the x-axis, you can see that those are dates and not actually a made-up unit. And so I've just graphed a couple of things out on here, and what you can see, has anyone else wondered what they were putting in the water in 1995? Because it was an explosion of fascinating programming languages, and that is when JavaScript popped up. And then you kind of follow in, and we have Wasm here in 2017. Yeah, honestly, I think browser adoption was at the very beginning of anyways, it's very, very, very new. And so obviously what I'm trying to do is have you see this pattern, which is to say everything, oh, I see heads shaking. Everyone's like, your science is horrible. But I think it's interesting, and I think this is a way you can tell a story. And so I do think that we are seeing a turn back down from high-level abstractions to understanding that the high-level abstractions that we've created for ourselves have faulty foundations, and that we're now returning to a revisiting of those foundations to see what we can do to then meet those higher abstractions and build them on a better foundation. And I actually think Lynn's talk was like a very good introduction to this, which is like, we're now returning, we've seen what these ecosystems have done, and now we need to check out what's going on in that foundation below us. So, but, and again, to make this point, it's been a second since we've done this. It's been a fair amount of time. All right, and so to take this same map and go, okay, why is this happening now? This is a brief history of the internet and kind of what the internet was doing. We have the 2 major world wars marked on here. Those are tough times, they're tough times. But what we can see as a pattern, and if we throw some more of these things in here, what we are seeing is that the speed of computation in the browser, the demands for computation in the browser are going up. Now, I am not entirely sure if this is true, but one of the things that I did find very interesting is that a lot of the browser optimizations that we start seeing originally first in TraceMonkey, then V8 followed up, were actually very motivated by the desire to optimize performance for Google Maps. And so what we've realized is that the web is like an absolutely fantastic distribution platform, and the things that we want to put on the web are like deeply rich and full of computation. And so all of the things that we kind of originally thought the web was for, we're just growing them. We're like, what else can we put on the web? What else can we put on the web? And as a result, our needs are growing. So this is not a new problem. How many Flash developer comrades do I have in the audience? Yeah. I was a teenage Flash developer, and it was super fun. I was actually telling some of the organizers earlier that someone actually paid me some money to write Flash for them, and that was super cool. And so I do like to think of WebAssembly as kind of the second coming of Flash, and only second to Excel spreadsheets would I say that Flash was probably one of the most successful web development platforms of our time. I have a deep respect for that, and a lot of people get very feisty with me when I say things like that, because things like Excel and things like Flash are not considered real programming. But yet they are wildly successful, and they gave access to developing for the web in a way that many other technologies have not been successful at doing it. So many other people have tried this. We have our smattering of things. That is not the native client logo, but you get it, right? A knackle, I don't know. I couldn't find the logo. But people have been trying to solve this problem before, and I do think it's very exciting that we have kind of a confluence of both material and historical conditions that are really allowing WebAssembly to be taken, like, I think that we've finally got the right approach. So again, we've been trying very hard to like make JavaScript work, and WebAssembly is kind of this acknowledgement, maybe JavaScript doesn't work for everything. And I think this is actually very relieving for JavaScript, because I feel like JavaScript has been saying this since 1995. And that's really tough. And it turns out that being, like, if you're not good at everything, it doesn't mean that you can't be good at, like, a couple of things. And so I am very excited for that. But this is kind of where we found ourselves. Because JavaScript was the one thing in the browser, we've been trying to make it do 1,000 things, especially as we've seen an exponential growth in the desire that we have to put things on the web. So that's kind of why we're here. Let's look at this second question, which is that performance is not as a large concern as you would expect. So I know at least my introduction to WebAssembly was like, hey, we got to make things go fast on the web, and JS doesn't go fast, and so now we have this. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess that makes sense. Now, I'm sure that's not the marketing message everybody got, but I think that that's actually relatively representative of the marketing message most people get. So you can take a look at the spec. This is kind of some statements, some design goals. I really love reading specs. If you don't read them, I recommend you read them. But here you can see that we focus a lot, again, fast, safe, and portable. That's really cool, but again, very much focusing on fast. And then again, I think the efficient, portable representation. I actually really like the spec, and I think stating values and visions like this are very interesting, but I think that there's something missing. So as I said, I love reading specs. This is from the design principles in the HTML5 spec, where they say, in the case of conflict, Consider users over authors, over implementers, over specifiers, over theoretical purity. How many people have read this statement? I would just recommend, if you are a developer and you work on a team, that you just print this out and put it in your office. I really like this. As a design value, the thing that I like the most about it is that it talks about what you do in cases of conflict. I would love to believe that for the future of WebAssembly, we will be able to do all of these things, and they will never come in conflict with each other. But I think we're already at a point where they are coming into conflict with each other. And what I would like to hear is an articulation of the vision of what we do when these values start coming into conflict. So what I say here is I think prioritization is hard. You know, we're supposed to love all of our children equally, right? But sometimes when push comes to shove, we're going to have to pick one. So we can't. So how many people know who this gentleman is here? All right, so for folks who don't, I have been corrected on the name multiple times with different accuracies. So Bjarne Stroustrup, I believe is how you say it. He's the creator of C++, and he tells this story. Now, before I go too far into the story, what I do want to say is it's kind of a scary story, but I don't think we're there yet. But I think that it matters that we tell stories like this early and often as we work on a new technology. So Bjarne wrote this paper, and he said this. He said, many or most people in Working Group 21, kind of like TC39, the working group that works in C++, are working independently towards non-shared goals. Individually, many/most proposals make sense. Together, they are insanity, and by the way, don't use that word to describe stuff, it's ableist, but to the point of endangering the future of C++. So what does this mean, right? They got lots of proposals, but they have lost that coherence, right? And so the title of his blog post was this thing called Remember the Vasa, and I just still cannot believe that this is actually a true story. So this is a picture of a boat called the Vasa. It is a Swedish boat, and King, back in the day, was like, I want to make like the sickest military boat ever. And so what they did was like, all right, you know, I don't know if you ever played like SimCity or something, you're just like kind of going wild, and you're like, let's have 8 like fire departments. But they built this boat, and they're like, let's just slap on a whole bunch of cannons here, and this, and this, and they threw it all together. And unfortunately, on a day with completely normal weather conditions, it sailed, I don't know, probably for like a couple hours and just like completely collapsed. And this is because of kind of a lack of a coherence in the design. They had been very kind of like slapstick, let's throw a whole bunch of this stuff on, and then it just completely fell over. So what he wrote here is, we need a reasonably coherent language that can be used by quote-unquote ordinary programmers whose main concern is to ship great applications on time. We now have about 150 cooks. Changes metaphor immediately here, no explanation. We now have about 150 cooks. That's not a good way to get a tasty and balanced meal. We are on the path to something that could destroy C++. We must get off the path. Now, you know, it's what, WebAssembly came around in 2017, it's 2019, we're at the first WebAssembly summit, and I'm going, disaster! I should like have a tinfoil hat on or something, right? But that's not what I'm trying to say. I don't think that we're necessarily in a position like this now, but what I do think is that we have a lot of audiences and we have a lot of fascinating use cases for WebAssembly, and we are lacking a communicated and shared vision about those things. So coherence keeps me up at night. It keeps me up at night about Rust. It keeps me up at night about WebAssembly. And fundamentally, if we look back at this quote, I think the thing that struck me most is when Bjarne said, we need a reasonably coherent language that can be used by ordinary programmers. And I was like, okay. And so that brings me to our third point, which is a lot of people haven't tried WebAssembly yet. Literally no judgment. Is there anybody here who has not written any WebAssembly? Thank you for coming. That's really awesome. I hope that I've not scared you away. I want you to use it, and that's what this whole section is about. So when we talk about why people maybe haven't used it yet, let's take a look at the state of WebAssembly today. So we're going to do a little interactivity, right? Okay, so these are probably the 3 most primary WebAssembly toolchains here. How many people have written Rust-generated WebAssembly? You can raise your hand for multiple things, by the way, too. Cool. How about mscripten? How about assembly script? Awesome. All right, that's super great. And then kind of 2 honorable mentions here. Does anybody know what that logo is, the @ sign? Why is that the logo? Does anyone know? Anyways, Blazor is super, super awesome. I also couldn't believe that that was the logo. Anybody here write Blazor? That's freaking awesome. They're doing so many incredibly exciting things. And then Go Wasm? Awesome. So one of the things I think has been very interesting, I've seen some people raise their hand for every single one of these, and I genuinely want to sit down and chat with you and figure out how you're like managing your multi-language workflow, because I think that that is fascinating. I think it's like very cool and probably a future that we're going to see, and figuring out what those workflows should look like is cool. All right, so these are kind of the primary ones, and I'll admit that I kind of took this ranking from my co-organizer, Surma, who gave a talk called Polyglot WebAssembly, which whenever I'm preparing a talk, I always watch like 5,000 other talks to like prepare, because I like get nervous that I'm going to say something stupid and want to make sure people agree with me. But I was watching it, and he said that these were kind of the primary ones, and these were honorable mentions. And he proceeded to do these graphs, which I think are very interesting and kind of gave me some of the motivation for this final sentence, or final section, which is, so when we looked at the size generally generated by WebAssembly, we saw that assembly script made very, very small ones, largely because it's kind of like a very thin abstraction over assembly. And then Rust kind of in the middle. I was surprised. I thought Rust would be way up at the top, just for how many people use format in their Rust. And then up here, Emscripten, because of so much of the glue code that it's able to generate for you. And then he kind of looked at the ecosystem. And this is when I started kind of having some questions. I'm like, I want to know more about like the methods here. Like, when you say ecosystem, do you mean like available libraries that are possible to compile to these? I wasn't entirely sure, but again, we see the same ranking. And then finally, I saw this one. And so as somebody who cares tremendously about developer experience, when anyone tells me that anything just works, I'm always very, very surprised. Now, one thing I did notice is Emscripten's been very much at the top of these graphs, but he moved it down just slightly to indicate that maybe it doesn't entirely just work, but like just a little. So I thought that that was appropriate. But the first thing that I'll say is like, part of my motivation for working on the Rust WebAssembly toolchain was that I was very, very intimidated by the Emscripten toolchain. I really, really struggled with it. I have mad respect for the people who work on it, and there's like lots of really awesome stuff. But I was trying to teach an intern at Cloudflare I had last summer. And when we talk about this just works, I kind of asked for who, because when I was teaching him this, when you're trying to automate WebAssembly toolchains, this is actually from a tweet where he scrolls through all of the flags. But there's a lot of flags from Emscripten, and that's super awesome. Like, the amount of configuration you can do is really, really, really cool, but it's also deeply, deeply intimidating. And so again, looking through these, what I started really asking myself is like, who is WebAssembly for? And like, for what use case? Like, when you say it just works, like in what way? And I do believe, not to tell someone that I was like doing it wrong, I meant like you have a pre-existing code base and you just like want to throw a compiler at it. Are you, Surma's pouting over there? You mad? You mad? Okay, we're gonna fight later. Excellent. Cool. I'll see you later. Okay. But yeah, I was like, okay, for what use case? And admittedly, the question of what is the use case of WebAssembly has come up so many times in the Rust Wasm working group. When we try and write documentation, when we try and come up with like examples, like what should the hello world be? It's just like, oh no. It's really, really hard to figure that stuff out right now. And I think that this is kind of that really awesome moment where we gotta really do that hard work to figure it out. So I'm gonna bring this up. It almost feels like bringing this study up is a little bit like left padding people at NPM, which is to say, this is a white paper where people did an analysis of how WebAssembly is currently being used on the web. How many people have seen this paper? How many people liked it? Okay, yep. Yeah. So I bring this up not to do like a name and shame, but I think it's really interesting as we try and think about what are the motivating use cases for WebAssembly? What are we designing our tools to build? That we ask ourselves, okay, well, what are people building today? And I think it's, so we can go through a little bit. I actually included this because it doesn't really talk about the what, but I did think it was very interesting that the distribution of execution time spent in Wasm code is nothing in the middle. There's like a big giant gulf. Either you spend very, very small amount of time in your Wasm code, or you spend a ton of time in your Wasm code, and there's kind of nothing in the middle, which I think is really awesome. Anyways, the thing that I wanted to focus on, which I kind of think is the conclusion of this, is overall we discovered that 1,600 sites loading 1,900 Wasm models, of which 150 are unique samples. Those numbers are wild. Fundamentally, what that means is that some of the Wasm modules are so popular that they're found on many, many different sites. All right. In one case, the exact same module was present on 346 different sites. So one of the things that makes me think is the dependency system, like package reuse that we complain about so often in JavaScript, that is alive and well in WebAssembly today. But it also says that, hey, if we could just make one killer use case and establish some of these libraries, this is a really awesome way to actually get people to adopt this technology. Now, the question now is what was in that, and it was a Bitcoin miner. Who's surprised? No one is surprised. But that's kind of frustrating, right? We have this awesome technology. The vast majority of people today are using it to mine Bitcoin. This is not to say anything bad about people who are interested in blockchain technologies. Bitcoin's just not for me. But why is this happening, right? And I think it's this. So you know it's a viral tweet because I have a typo, which is very embarrassing. But it's a picture of two people, and she says, "I like this painting because it has a bench." All right. Many times our choices are made because we've made it easier to appreciate or use. So I have this horrible saying, these are not real numbers, but they're my thing, and I say ergonomics is 80% familiarity, 10% ambition, and 10% laziness. Which is to say, we build the tools that we know, and we love the tools that we are used to. And I think this is really important as we think about the future of WebAssembly, and who is in the room, and what tools we're building. So as I told you, I was a teenage Flash developer. Flash was a delightful experience. Developing with Flash was great. Even today, Till mentioned that probably for animations, it might still be a best-of-class user experience, and I don't disagree, right? I tried to look up if anyone had any thought pieces on why Adobe Flash was successful, and I just got a bunch of to-do things about how to fix if you can't install Adobe Flash. But I don't need a paper to cite Adobe Flash was overwhelmingly successful, and if WebAssembly has any sort of ambition, we should hope to achieve at least that level of success, but obviously we'd like to do better. This is a graph of the % of users who encountered at least one page with Flash Player content in a day. In 2014, 80% of users encountered at least one thing with Flash Player. I would really love to see that happen for WebAssembly. All right, so why, right? We go back, what should the WebAssembly website be in Wasm? And I say no, definitely not, at least not yet. And it's because Wasm simply isn't usable enough. I think that we have massive gaps in developer experience, and my biggest concern is I don't think we are currently investing in them. So WebAssembly is not here to kill JavaScript, because murder is a terrible growth strategy. But also, again, I think we're doing it wrong if we want it to. To make WebAssembly successful, we need everybody's help, and everyone isn't here yet. So this is a paraphrase from Russ Cox when he was talking about inclusivity programs for Go. However, I think that this works when we think about developing tools for WebAssembly as well. So there was this question of worse is better, which Lynn brought up. I don't know if people are familiar with this ideology. It's often called New Jersey style, which I really love because I am a Jersey girl. It's from this website, if we want to talk about edgy technologies. And I highly recommend Googling these essays and taking a read of them. There's the rise of worse is better is worse, worse is better is worse is better. There's a whole series of these people. But for me, at least, what I believe is that one of the primary motivators of these articles is that getting your technology into the hands of your end users as fast as possible can be as valuable, if not more valuable, than getting it right before you release it. I don't think it's necessarily a harsh yes or no around these things, but I do think that we need to get WebAssembly in the hands of more people. So you might be saying, WebAssembly's new, like you're rushing us, and so this is my Twitter profile, and I'm totally willing to admit, as I say, a mess like this is usually 5 to 10 years ahead of its time. So maybe I'm rushing us, and I'm actually okay with that. But this is my absolutely horrible Drake pun, so here we go. Currently, as WebAssembly is developed, we started from the bottom, really close to the metal, and now we're here. But I want us to start from the bottom and then the whole team here. It's bad, I know. All right. So what I mean by that horrible thing is that I think right now is the time that we need to invest in the tools and programs to get WebAssembly into the hands of the people we are making it for. I think we will learn a lot, and I'm worried that we're not doing it. And so what I'll leave you with is this. So this is a dramatization of a statement made by a fantastic designer named Kathy Sierra. And we have Mario here on the corner, and he's a person who's a potential customer. And then we have the product, which I actually learned when I first saw this is called a fire flower. And then we have Fire Mario. In the Mario game, if you pick up a fire flower, you become Fire Mario. And Kathy Sierra's point here was a lot of companies build things where they think the fire flower is the product, right? But they're wrong, or at least Kathy thinks they're wrong, and I agree with Kathy, all right? The product that you have is the Fire Mario, the awesome person who can do rad shit, right? So this was actually a moment in Rust. We call it the Fire Flower time, where about every thought leader in Rust started writing about this thing because we're in the process of trying to figure out how we can actually market Rust to be this empowering technology. And so Steve Klabnik wrote an article with this quote that I think is really fantastic and extremely on point, where he says, memory safety without garbage collection is the mechanism of how this is accomplished, but it's not the accomplishment itself. It's the Fire Flower, not the Fire Mario, talking about Rust and garbage collection. And what he says here is, I'd like to make sure that we're talking about being Fire Mario rather than being Fire Flower enthusiasts. So, as I told you, I am motivated by building things that people use. I like to work on technologies that are empowering, all right? Julia Evans has this fantastic cartoon about what empowering technology can mean. It's empowering for a wide variety of people who might not otherwise consider themselves systems programmers. I think this applies to Rust. I think this applies to WebAssembly, right? I am not a Fire Flower enthusiast, and we will spend the rest of this day talking about how exciting WebAssembly is and all of the fantastic things we can do. But I want us to remember at the end of the day that we are here to enable Fire Marios. Thank you very much.